Ever since the railways were privatised in 1993, there has been much debate on whether this was the right thing to do. This video will explain the arguments for the successes and failures of privatisation, and some of the recommendations on how the setup can be changed or improved. First, let's look at the arguments for why people believe that privatisation has been a success. One argument that is brought up time and time again is the number of passenger journeys has increased almost year on year since privatisation, changing the trend of stagnant numbers under British Rail. This is true, as numbers have gone from 740 million passenger journeys in 1993 to 94 to 1.29 billion in 2016 to 17. Opponents will argue that the rise is due to various outside factors such as population changes, changing commuter patterns, rising environmental concerns, and stagnant car usage. One thing to note is the rate of growth that Britain experiences on the railways is higher than similar European countries such as France, Germany and Italy, which all have less privatisation than Britain. Privatisation has also helped to attract private investment in the railways. Private investment in the rail industry has been increasing over the past years, doubling to 925 million between 2013 and 2017. This has been alongside a government-controlled shift in the level of how much the users of the railways fund the system, increasing from 56% in 2010 to 11 to 71% in 2014 to 2015. This has meant that the percentage of government input in the railways budget has been decreasing. This has not come without its critics, with many people claiming that rail prices are at unaffordable levels and continue to rise every year. However, the majority of train journeys start or end in London, and most of the amount of rail trips are made by people in the highest income level, almost 4 times as more than the people in the lowest income. Some would therefore argue that it's unfair for taxpayers to subsidise tickets for journeys made mainly in one region and by people with above average incomes. In spite of this argument, recent figures show that this trend of pushing more of the costs onto rail users may not be sustainable in the long term. This can be particularly seen with season ticket users, where the increasing costs have seen these type of journeys falling in recent years. Privatisation has also opened up the railways to foreign companies to operate on the tracks to much controversy. Some people argue that this has led to profits being taken abroad. The counter-argument can be the opening up of the railways has allowed more competition within the bidding process of franchises and allows expertise from other countries to be brought over and implemented on Britain's railways, potentially bringing benefits to them. Despite people's unhappiness at foreign companies operating on Britain's railways, it must be said that railway liberalisation, which allows particularly other European operators running railway services, is currently law implemented by the European Union's passing of the railway packages. Despite these positives, limitations have been pointed out in the privatisation setup, especially in the franchising process. It's been noted that the franchising process, which was initially designed to promote competition in the railways, has started to have the opposite effect. One particular aspect is the use of direct awards in the business. A direct award is the awarding of a franchise to a particular operator directly, without the tendering process, resulting in no competition. This type of award has been done 7 times up to 2014, and another 6 more are anticipated between 2014 and 2020. Direct awards could be a symptom caused by the high costs of putting forward a bid to run a franchise, which could be anywhere from £5 to £10 million, as well as financial protection if the franchise fails, which could amount to £200 million, as in the case of the TransPennine franchise. This increasing cost has ultimately led to less potential bids for new franchises, with just 2 bids on both the West Midlands and South Western franchises. The structure of tendering itself has led to over-optimistic projections from bidders in order to win franchises, which has led to franchises exiting early when they don't meet those projections. There have been notable examples of this, particularly on the East Coast Main Line, with 2 of the previous operators having to finish their franchises early due to lower than expected earnings. The same thing also happened in 2012 with the reletting of the West Coast Main Line franchise, with significant flaws in the bids, leading to the temporary suspension of the franchising process and cost the taxpayers at least £50 million. The nature of franchising has also led to near-regional monopolies restricting competition. A notable example of this is the Wrexham and Shropshire Railway. The Wrexham and Shropshire Railway was an open access operator providing rail services from Wrexham to London between April 2008 and January 2011. In spring 2010, Wrexham and Shropshire scored 99% of respondents rating the service satisfactory or good in the National Passenger Survey, the highest score in the history of the survey. The service was restricted by a moderation of competition clause which prevented Wrexham and Shropshire from calling at stations on the West Coast Main Line, such as Birmingham New Street or the Chiltern Main Line, as it could potentially abstract revenue from the incumbent operators on those lines. The railway eventually went out of business in 2011. Although there are various reasons to its demise, it is a prime example of how a challenger to services was restricted from competing due to the franchising setup. The contribution the rolling stock companies have had on the rail industry can also be scrutinised. The initial idea of rolling stock companies was that train operating companies would have a choice for the type of stock they could use and who they got it from. This setup has produced some positive results, with 51% of trains on the railway being built during privatisation period. On the whole, however, train operating companies do not have a great choice with what trains they use on their lines, with practical and engineering constraints such as platform modifications limiting the interchanging of trains on different lines. This means that train operating companies are restricted when obtaining rolling stock, especially as there is only a limited amount available. This puts very little risk on the rolling stock companies owning of rolling stock that isn't being utilised, as they know that there is little option for train operating companies to go and procure rolling stock, reducing incentives. Although smaller companies such as Macquarie Rail have entered the market to supply trains, 89% of trains in Britain are owned by the big three rolling stock companies. The results have seen the government admitting that the market is not functioning as originally intended. In recent years, this has led to the government deciding to take more of an active role in procuring new stock for railway lines, directly from train manufacturers, setting up mini rolling stock companies, bypassing the existing rolling stock providers. This can be seen in the Intercity Express programme and Thameslink rail upgrade with the creation of Agility trains. From Network Rail's inception in 2002, it has continued to make Britain's railway the safest large railway in Europe. This has not come without consequences, however. Network Rail has a very high amount of debt of £44.8 billion in 2016-17, which all goes on the government's balance sheet. Efficiency in Network Rail has also dropped by 4.4% between 2014 and 2017. So, what are some of the potential problems that the company faces? As there is a separation between track and train services, there are problems with the amount of risk that spreads between the two entities. A lot of risk resides with Network Rail, who have responsibility of looking after the infrastructure. If there are any issues with the infrastructure, they are required to compensate train operating companies. Notable examples of this are shutting the railway for engineering works, called Schedule 4 payments, and if there are any unexpected delays or cancellations due to problems with the infrastructure, this is called a Schedule 8 payment. Due to the fact that Network Rail is mostly government funded, the train operating company's exposure to changes in Network Rail's expenditure is removed. With fixed access charges during a franchise period, this all means that there is very little negotiation between the two entities to increase efficiency. To summarise, it could be claimed that there have been benefits from privatisation, whether that is increase in passenger numbers, less reliance on taxpayers to fund the railways, more private investment, or foreign expertise being injected into the railways. However, the counter-argument for some of these successes are that it is by no means clear whether they were exclusively because of privatisation or other factors have had a bigger contribution. This includes changing travel patterns, greater environmental concerns, or changing government policy. Privatisation has had disadvantages within its setup, whether that is lack of on-the-rail competition, high fares, limitations in the franchising process, little competition and low risk in the rolling stock market, and inefficiencies in Network Rail, partly due to the vertical separation of the railways. So what could be done to improve the railways long term? Here are three potential options. The first one would be to increase the on-the-rail competition, whether that be through the increasing of open access operators on the railway or having two operators on a franchise. Another would be the renationalisation of the railways, which would be potentially feasible due to Britain leaving the EU. This would mean greater integration between track and train services, reducing the potential amount of money lost to compensation and other inefficiencies due to vertical separation. It would also mean profit generated from rail services could be invested back into the railway instead of money being lost to the private sector. Limitations of this would be the sheer scale of change for the rail industry, which may take years to adapt to. Privatisation has done a good job at making nationalisation logistically and financially difficult. If the government were to renationalise the railways immediately, the cost would be very large, as it would either have to buy back the franchise early, pumping lots of money into foreign governments who operate the services. This would further support the claim that foreign operators make vast sums of money on Britain's railways. The alternative would be to wait for them to expire, which could be up to 15 years, which may not be technically feasible due to the ever-changing political situation. On top of this, a publicly owned railway would own no trains to run the services. This would mean the government would either have to lease the existing trains from rolling stock companies, allowing them to continue profiting, buy them back at the expense of the taxpayer, or procure new ones which could take many years to implement. Finally, a publicly owned railway could potentially have a tough time at attracting private investment, meaning the railway would rely on funding from two sources, the government and fares. So, to increase the spending on the railways, it would most likely mean an increase in one of these categories, which in both cases is not likely to please the general public. Finally, the country could look to the past and allow for a private company to own both the infrastructure and services, like in the 1930s under the Big Four. This could allow for greater integration between track and train, with private funding still being used to fund the railways, reducing government input, and through owning the tracks would give greater incentive to increase efficiencies. This sort of model has been argued in the past, with a railway network being around 4,000 kilometres for optimal running. This would see the current system broken up into 3 or 4 networks, a structure similar to what is done in Japan, which is known as a good example of an efficient and punctual railway. The limitations of this model could be less government involvement with the potential for mismanagement and could put less profitable services at risk without government support. I for one would advocate for greater on-track competition being the most feasible with the current railway setup. The nature of open access operators is more complementary to the competitive nature of privatisation. No subsidies are awarded to open access operators, which means they do not have a fallback source of income from the government, so are required to adapt to the rail market. They are also not subjected to the same regulations as franchises are, which gives them the more flexibility to innovate within the market. There are also some drawbacks, however. More competition means the economy of scale which comes from larger companies will be reduced, leading to higher costs. Greater competition will also create a more fragmented network, making it harder for cooperation between different companies as they won't all sing from the same hymn sheet. However, it could be expected that actual on-rail competition will drive greater efficiencies, improve services, and with appropriate regulation from the government, could help to improve the rail network. It can be already seen on the East Coast Main Line. Both open access operators Grand Central and Hull Trains compete for price against the incumbent operator Virgin Trains East Coast. The result of this provides competitive ticket prices and both provide better quality services as determined by recent passenger surveys. The dilemma with the railways is that many people see them as a public service helping connect communities together. However, they are a costly service. It was thought that private industry could be brought in to help run the railways better with the idea of reducing government support. However, this hasn't come without issues. At the end of the day, views on the railways will come down to personal opinion and how much societal value they have. This in turn will determine as to how much the government should be responsible for the railways. One thing is for sure, the current structure of the railways faces increasingly testing times and needs to evolve if it is to survive in its current form. If not, the ever-increasing support from nationalisation and a change in government could spell the end of the privatisation setup of the railways.